There's so much to discuss tonight, so let's bring in the panel. In Sydney, his terrific broadcaster, Kel Richards. Good evening and welcome, Kel.
G'day, Jane. Always nice to be here with you.
Love having you on the program. And here in Perth with me, Dr. Martin Drum, Senior Lecturer in Politics and International Relations at the University of Notre Dame in Fremantle. Martin, good evening and welcome.
Good evening, Jane. Great to be here.
Well, Kel and Martin, the big story, and I thought it was explosive, the stuff that Nick McKenzie brought us yesterday, or today, last night, in the 9 newspapers. There's a follow-up today of the story of this incredibly brave, I would say, young Chinese spy who has defected to Australia. And front page on the Sun Herald tomorrow, former spy deserves protection, Liberal MP. This is Andrew Hastie. Prominent Liberal MP Andrew Hastie has praised the courage of a former Chinese spy who has defected to Australia and has called for the government to protect him urgently. Make note of that word, urgently. Mr Hastie, who chairs Federal Parliament's Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, said the intelligence operative Wang Lishuang was a friend of democracy for exposing the Chinese government's systematic and sweeping foreign interference operations. He says, I'm of the view that anyone who's willing to assist us in defending our sovereignty deserves our protection. He's urging the government to grant Mr Wang asylum. I think he deserves our protection and our support. Kel, I'll go to you on this first. I read in detail today that report, the story, the background is just incredible of what this young man has gone through. He's really blown the whistle on what's going on in Hong Kong, talking about Chinese spies infiltrating the pro-democracy, the Umbrella Brigade, the pro-democracy groups, to then sort of go back and report on what is happening. It's an extraordinary story, isn't it?
It is amazing. And in fact, one of the allegations he's made is that he knows about assassinations committed on the orders of the communist authorities in Beijing. This made me cast my mind back to 1954 and the Petrov case. When the Petrovs, Vladimir Petrov and his wife Evdokia Petrov, defected, they were Russian spies operating in Australia, KGB or MDV as they were in those days. When they defected and they spilled everything they knew to ASIO, it was a huge story and it dominated Australian politics for a long time, for a whole lot of reasons. Now, I think we are just seeing the tip of the iceberg at this stage. More and more is going to come out, and it's going to become harder and harder for Australian politicians to say, look, Chinese trade is so important to us, we can't say anything rude about the Chinese, we can't ever be open about what they're actually doing inside our country. That's going to become harder. I think this is going to become an enormous story, as big as the Petrov story. So over the next week, this will just explode. That's my theory.
Martin, I agree with Kel, absolutely. And I think you're right, Kel, to take it back to the Petrovs. We saw today that the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, he was at a conference, the Victorian Liberal Annual Conference in Ballarat. The Sydney Morning Herald reporting this afternoon when Josh Frydenberg was asked about this, and we know that it'll be, these stories will continue. It'll be on 60 Minutes tomorrow night, and Nick McKenzie will continue to write about this very brave young man in Monday's papers as well. Federal Treasurer Josh Frydenberg has described revelations of China's extensive foreign interference activities by a spy who defected as very disturbing, but wouldn't say whether the man would be granted asylum. Martin.
Yeah, it's a really interesting story, and you're spot on. It's absolutely extraordinary, the details that he's said to have about Chinese operations in Australia and elsewhere. And one thing that you'd probably think about is you hope his personal safety is maintained, because when these things become public, there's a genuine risk to him and his person. With the Treasurer, he's trying to walk a fine line. So I think that it's clear that he has to acknowledge the revelations, but he doesn't want to interfere with the process. So he's got to say the process has to run its course. It's hard to see on prima facie on what we've seen come out in the papers how he cannot be granted asylum under these circumstances.
Well, Kel, he was also very clear in this interview with Nick McKenzie, Grace Tobin and Paul Sakal in the 9 papers that he fears for his life. He has virtually bid his parents and grandparents goodbye. He went into Taiwan and was he's telling us that the Chinese Communist Party directed him to take on a new identity, to go in there and to recruit in the more recent elections to try and unseat the president. And he goes into a lot of detail, but basically says that he fears for his life, doesn't he?
Yeah. And that's absolutely true. Martin's made that point. You've made that point. It's absolutely true. And that's the reason why there should be no delay and no hesitancy in granting him asylum and safety. I mean, that's what happened with the Petrovs. They were granted asylum in Australia. They were hidden in a safe house at Palm Beach, the Sydney beachside suburb, while they were debriefed by ASIO. Then they were given different identities and they lived the rest of their lives in Melbourne in a little suburban house. It is possible to make someone safe who's done this kind of thing, but that can only happen. That process begins when they're granted asylum. So until they're granted asylum, there really isn't a mechanism to put them into a safe house, to give them another identity, to keep them really safe. So that's why it has to happen quickly, I think.
It really does, and he'll be on he's all over the papers tomorrow, Martin. He'll be on the TV tomorrow night. They've already released little grabs of some of the things that he's had to say. Look, Martin, you and I are here in Western Australia. Clive Hamilton, Professor Clive Hamilton, who wrote about China's silent invasion, is now penning another book, is very critical of some of the heavy hitters in the mining industry in Western Australia. He calls Western Australia the China Club, and certainly our Premier in Western Australia, Mark McGowan, has been deeply critical of Andrew Hastie for having a pretty nuanced view on our sovereignty and our security when it comes to China. Do you think that this will have the cut through in WA? It's going to have cut through on the East Coast. Do you think it's going to have any impact here?
I'm not entirely sure. We are entirely focused on our relationship with China. It's a massive talking point in the political and business elites in this state. I think these revelations, taken in concert with a range of other revelations, need to be discussed and need to feed into that discussion around our trade relationship. Absolutely. I'm not entirely sure that much will change in Western Australia because we're still very heavily focused.
Indeed.
Jane, may I leap in and ask a question of you and Martin, because I'd be interested to know what you think. Will this be an embarrassment for Victoria? We've had Daniel Andrews signing up to Beijing's Belt and Roads Initiative and cozying up to China. Does it suddenly become, not just for WA a problem, but for Daniel Andrews in Victoria? Is it a problem for him?
Well, there was a story today, wasn't there, saying I think that ASIO was keeping a pretty close eye. Someone correct me if I'm wrong. I think it was ASIO was keeping a pretty close eye on what's going on with the Belt and Road in Victoria. Kel, I'll be on Talkback Radio on 3AW on Monday night, and I will ask the question, because whenever we start talking about this, there's been a real shift. There's been an enormous shift, because people sort of thought at the start that this was xenophobia. There's been a real shift on Talkback Radio. People are now wise to this. So yes, my answer would be I think there will be pressure. Martin, what do you think?
I think public opinion is always important, and I think you're right, Jane. I think there's a lot more awareness now. There's been pockets of discussion, whether it's at universities, whether it's at whether it's a case like this, whether it's about Hong Kong. But I think the culmination of all of those issues being discussed raises a lot more questions. But I don't know if it's just a WA Victoria thing. I think there's actually a lot of business elites, a lot of people that are trying to balance it or walking on the fence here, and they're all going to be having awkward conversations around this.